My name is Michelle, and for 19 years, my mother introduced her job before she introduced me. This is my daughter, she's still figuring things out. She'd say at every company picnic, every holiday party, every occasion where her coworkers happened to be in the room, as though I were a permanent, unfinished project rather than a grown woman with an actual life. I let her say it, mostly, because correcting her had never once changed the sentence. And then, at her own retirement party, in a hotel banquet room full of 41 years of coworkers, she said it one final time, louder and clearer than ever before. And this time her boss was standing close enough to hear every word, and close enough to disagree with it, on the record, in front of everyone. I want to take you back to where this actually started, because a comment like that doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of a whole architecture of small dismissals built up over decades, and my mother, Diane, built that architecture with real dedication, even if she never once thought of it that way herself. My mother worked for the same company, a mid-size regional insurance firm called Harwick Mutual, for her entire adult life, starting as a claims processor at 19 and working her way up, over 4 decades, to office manager, a role she held with real pride for the last 15 years of her career. I want to be fair to her here, because her career itself is genuinely admirable. She built something real out of steady, unglamorous, decades-long effort. And there's nothing wrong with that kind of life. The problem was never what she built for herself. The problem was what she assumed everyone else needed to build too, in exactly the same shape, on exactly the same timeline, to count as having made it. My mother believed, with total conviction, that a stable job with a clear title, a predictable paycheck, and visible upward movement within a single company was the only legitimate definition of success. She'd worked her way from claims processor to office manager over 4 decades at Harwick Mutual. And in her mind, that was the template, the only template, for a life that counted. I didn't follow that template. Not because I rejected it out of any particular philosophy, but because the thing I actually loved doing, the thing I turned out to be good at, didn't fit inside it. I was drawn to numbers early, the same way some kids are drawn to music or sports, an instinct that showed up before I could fully explain it. In high school, while my mother was pushing me towards something practical, something with benefits, something steady, I was quietly falling in love with statistics and financial modeling, staying up late working through problem sets that felt, to me, less like homework and more like puzzles I genuinely wanted to solve. My mother didn't understand any of this, and to be fair, I don't think she was trying not to understand it. I think she simply didn't have a frame of reference for a career that didn't look like her own. And rather than asking questions to build that frame of reference, she just kept gently, persistently pushing me toward paths that made sense to her. Paths I had no real interest in. I studied finance and economics in college, on a partial scholarship supplemented by loans I took out myself, because my mother, despite having a stable income for most of my childhood, told me plainly that she wasn't going to bankroll a degree in something so uncertain, when I could just go into something practical like nursing or accounting, something with a real path. I remember that conversation specifically, sitting at our kitchen table with a course catalog spread out in front of me, watching her flip past every page related to finance and business analytics with the same dismissive speed she'd flip past a page of coupons for products we didn't buy. I graduated with a solid record, but not spectacular, not the kind of transcript that gets recruiters lining up at graduation. My first job out of college was unglamorous, an entry-level analyst position at a small regional consulting firm that specialized, somewhat ironically given everything that came later, in helping mid-size companies fix operational and financial problems before those problems became crises. I worked long hours for modest pay in those early years, building skills nobody at home particularly noticed or asked about, because by that point my mother had already, quietly and without much discussion, settled into a fixed narrative about who I was. Not ambitious, not particularly talented, a kid who'd chosen an impractical path and would probably need to be rescued from it eventually, the same way she occasionally, gently offered to put in a good word for me at Harwick Mutual, in case I ever wanted something stable instead. I never took her up on that offer. Every time she made it over the years at Thanksgiving at random Sunday phone calls, I could feel the specific weight of what she was actually saying underneath the words, which was that she didn't believe the path I'd chosen would ever amount to anything worth respecting, and that the kindest thing she could do was offer me an exit ramp back towards something she understood. I got good at my work, genuinely steadily good, the way people get good at things when nobody at home is paying close enough attention to notice the incremental progress happening somewhere else entirely. By 28, I'd moved to a larger consulting firm, specializing specifically in turnaround work, going into companies that were struggling, sometimes badly, and building the financial and operational restructuring plans that gave them a real shot at survival. It's demanding, high-stakes work, the kind where a wrong recommendation can cost people their jobs, and a right one can save an entire company's workforce. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I was built for exactly that kind of pressure, calm under it in a way that surprised colleagues who expected someone my age to crack under the weight of decisions that size. By 34, I'd been made a senior partner at my firm, one of the youngest in the company's history, leading turnaround engagements for companies with hundreds of employees, sometimes thousands, work that occasionally made small mentions in regional business journals, articles my mother never once seemed to see, or if she saw them, never once mentioned. I stopped bringing up my work in detail at family gatherings somewhere around 30, not out of any dramatic falling out, just a slow, practical recognition that describing it in detail never seemed to change how much space it occupied in her understanding of me. She'd ask politely, "How's the job going?" And I'd say, "Good, busy," and the conversation would move quickly back toward Harwick Mutual, toward whatever new initiative her department was rolling out, toward the specific, comfortable territory where she actually felt like she understood what she was talking about. I want to describe one particular moment from about 3 years ago, because it captures the pattern precisely. I just closed a major engagement, a turnaround for a regional manufacturing company that had been 18 months from bankruptcy when my team started working with them, and was, by the time we finished, not just stable but genuinely thriving again. 140 jobs saved that would otherwise have disappeared. It was honestly one of the proudest professional moments of my career up to that point. I mentioned it to my mother on a phone call, briefly, and she said, "That's nice, honey," before immediately pivoting to a story about a new copier Harwick Mutual had installed in the break room. I remember sitting in my apartment after that call, feeling something familiar settle over me, not quite anger, more a kind of tired, worn-down resignation, the specific feeling of understanding fully and finally that some part of your life is simply never going to register with certain people, no matter how significant it actually is. My mother announced her retirement about 8 months ago, 41 years at Harwick Mutual, and the company, to their real credit, decided to throw her a proper send-off, a formal event in a hotel banquet room catered with a slideshow the marketing department put together and speeches from several longtime colleagues. I attended, obviously. Whatever complicated feelings I carried about my mother, I loved her. And I wanted to be there to honor 4 decades of genuinely hard, genuinely admirable work. The room was full, probably 80 or 90 people, current and former Harwick Mutual employees, several of whom I recognized vaguely from childhood, faces I'd seen at company picnics decades earlier, now considerably older, gathered to celebrate my mother's career. I sat near the front with a few of her closest work friends, people who'd always been kind to me over the years, genuinely warm in a way that made me wish, sometimes, that warmth like that had existed more consistently at home. The speeches were lovely, honestly, several colleagues sharing specific, warm memories of my mother's decades of steady, reliable work, her patience training new hires, her genuine care for the people she managed. I felt real pride sitting there listening to it, and for a while that evening felt like exactly the tribute my mother deserved. Then came the toast portion of the evening, where guests were invited to stand and share something if they wanted to. My mother, glowing with the particular pride of someone at the center of a room built entirely to celebrate her, eventually gestured toward me, inviting me to say something in front of everyone. I stood, said a few genuine warm things about her work ethic, her dedication, the specific kind of steady reliability that had made her department run smoothly for so many years. It was sincere. I meant every word. And then when I sat back down, my mother, riding the high of the moment, decided to add something of her own, something meant, I think, as an affectionate joke, the kind of comment that had always gotten a small laugh at family gatherings without her ever fully registering how it landed on the other end. She said, to the room, gesturing toward me with real warmth in her voice that made the words somehow worse rather than better. "This one, though. Smart as anything, but I always told her, find something practical, something steady. She's still out there figuring it out, still hasn't quite settled into anything real. I love her to death, but I always worried she'd never really amount to anything. Chasing all these uncertain little consulting jobs instead of building something solid like I did here." There was a small ripple of laughter in the room, the kind that thinks it's affectionate, the kind that assumes the person being described is in on the joke rather than absorbing it, again for what felt in that specific moment like the 1,000th time. I sat there, 37 years old, a senior partner who had personally led turnaround engagements protecting thousands of jobs across 30 companies over the past decade, being described at my own mother's retirement party as someone still figuring it out, someone chasing uncertain little jobs, someone who might never really amount to anything. I didn't say anything. I want to be honest about that. I smiled, the practiced, tired smile I'd gotten very good at over the years, and I let the moment pass because arguing with my mother's version of my life, in front of a room of her colleagues, at her own retirement celebration, felt like exactly the wrong moment to finally make my case, whatever that case might have looked like. What none of us in that room knew, including my mother, was that Harwick Mutual's president and CEO, a sharp, quietly formidable woman named Eleanor Vance, was seated at a table near the back, having come specifically to honor my mother's 4 decades of service, since she'd taken over leadership of the company only 6 years earlier, and had genuinely come to respect my mother's institutional knowledge during that transition. I want to explain something important here, because it's the hinge this entire story turns on. Eleanor Vance recognized my name and my face from somewhere else entirely, somewhere that had nothing to do with my mother. 3 years earlier, before Eleanor Vance had taken over as Harwick Mutual's CEO, the company had gone through a genuinely difficult period, an aggressive expansion into a new insurance product line that had gone badly wrong, nearly costing the company its financial stability, threatening layoffs across multiple departments, including, though my mother never fully knew the extent of it, her own department. Harwick Mutual's board at the time had brought in an outside consulting firm to help navigate the crisis, and the senior partner leading that engagement, working directly with the board and eventually recommending Eleanor Vance herself for the CEO position as part of the broader restructuring plan, had been me. I hadn't told my mother about that engagement, partly because of strict confidentiality obligations tied to the work itself, since turnaround engagements of that nature typically involve non-disclosure agreements protecting sensitive financial information from becoming public or reaching employees before the board is ready to communicate changes. But partly honestly because by that point in our relationship, I'd simply stopped volunteering details about my work to a mother who'd shown repeatedly that those details didn't register with her in any lasting way. I'd worked for nearly 4 months during that engagement in conference rooms just a few floors above where my mother sat every single day processing claims and managing her department, and she never once knew I was in the building because I deliberately scheduled my visits for early mornings and used a different entrance, out of respect for exactly the kind of confidentiality the engagement required. Eleanor Vance had worked closely with me during those 4 months, had watched me build the restructuring plan that ultimately saved not just the company's financial stability but specifically the jobs of over 60 employees who would otherwise have been let go, including, though she probably never fully realized the personal weight of this detail until that retirement party, several people in my mother's own department. She remembered me clearly. She remembered my name clearly. And she was sitting at that retirement party, close enough to hear every word of my mother's toast, close enough to watch me absorb it in practiced, tired silence. I watched Eleanor Vance's expression shift while my mother spoke, a specific, focused stillness settling over her face that I recognized, distantly, from board meetings years earlier. The look she got right before she decided to say something most people in the room weren't expecting. She didn't say anything immediately. The evening continued for a while longer, more speeches, more warm memories shared about my mother's career, and I genuinely thought, by the time dessert was served, that the moment had simply passed, unremarked upon, the way so many similar moments had passed before it over the years. Then, near the end of the evening, as the formal program was winding down, Eleanor Vance stood, unprompted, and asked if she could share a few words before everyone left. My mother, delighted at the idea of her CEO offering a personal tribute, gestured warmly toward the front of the room, clearly expecting another round of praise about her decades of reliable service. Eleanor Vance thanked my mother sincerely, genuinely, for her 4 decades of dedicated work, several specific, warm details about my mother's contributions that made clear this wasn't a generic corporate courtesy, but an actual, considered tribute. And then, without any particular drama in her voice, simply as a factual matter she seemed to feel needed correcting, she said, "I want to add one more thing, because I think this room should know it. and I suspect Diane herself doesn't fully know it either. She turned slightly toward me. 3 years ago, this company was in serious trouble. We were looking at layoffs across multiple departments, including, I believe, some positions in Diane's own team. The consultant who came in and built the plan that saved this company, who personally argued to the board for preserving jobs rather than the more aggressive cuts that were initially on the table, was Michelle. I remember the specific quality of the silence that followed, not quite the same as the silence in that ballroom during my brother's story, but similar in its texture. The sound of a room recalculating something in real time. My mother's face, from where I sat, went through several distinct stages very quickly, confusion first, then something like dawning recognition as she connected details she'd apparently never had reason to connect before, my occasional unexplained absences during a period she now seemed to be placing correctly, the vague, deflected answers I'd given whenever she asked about my work during those months. Eleanor Vance continued, her voice steady, factual, without any theatrical weight to it. Exactly the register you'd use correcting an inaccurate report in a board meeting. I don't know the details of Michelle's career outside what I witnessed directly, but I can tell you, without exaggeration, that the plan she built saved this company, saved this event from being an entirely different kind of gathering tonight, and saved, specifically, several jobs that would have been eliminated in Diane's own department. So when I hear that Diane's worried her daughter hasn't amounted to anything, I feel like this room should know that Michelle's work is a significant part of why there's still a Harwick Mutual left to retire from. I want to describe watching my mother's face during that explanation, because it's the part of this story that has stayed with me longest. Longer even than my own complicated feelings about finally being seen clearly in that room. She looked, first, stunned, in the purely factual sense of someone absorbing information too large to process quickly. Then she looked at me directly across the room, an expression I hadn't seen from her in years, something between confusion and a kind of grief. The specific grief of realizing you've been telling an inaccurate story about someone for a very long time, confidently, repeatedly, in front of people, without ever once checking whether the story was true. The room, predictably, turned toward me, a ripple of surprised, warm applause starting somewhere near the back and spreading forward. Several of my mother's colleagues, people who'd known me since childhood, looking at me with an expression that mixed genuine warmth with a kind of retroactive reassessment I could almost feel happening in real time. I didn't stand up and take a bow, or deliver some triumphant speech of my own. I simply nodded, said something modest about the whole team deserving the credit, because that was true, and let the moment exist in the room without trying to extend it further than it needed to go. My mother approached me afterward, once the formal program had wound down and people had started drifting toward the exits, and I want to be honest that the conversation that followed wasn't some cinematic, tearful reconciliation resolved neatly in a hotel hallway. It was smaller than that, more halting, more genuinely uncertain on both our parts. She asked quietly if it was true everything Eleanor had said, and I told her yes, walked her through a version of it, careful about the details still covered by confidentiality but honest about the shape of it, the months of work, the specific plan, the jobs it had protected, including, though I hadn't fully realized this detail myself until Eleanor mentioned it, some in her own department. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that I think was, for her, as close to a full apology as she knew how to give in that moment. She said, "I always thought I understood what a real career looked like. I don't think I ever really asked what yours actually was." I told her the truth, gently but honestly, that she hadn't, not in any sustained way, not in nearly 2 decades, and that the retirement party comment wasn't really the problem itself, just the loudest, most public version of a pattern that had been quietly running underneath our entire relationship for years. Things have shifted since then, in careful, incremental ways that I'm still getting used to, the same way, I suspect, many families shift after a moment like that, not through one dramatic conversation, but through a slow accumulation of smaller, more genuine ones that follow it. My mother calls more often now, asks actual questions about my work, questions that carry real curiosity rather than polite deflection. And I've noticed, more than once, that she remembers details from one conversation to the next, following up in a way she never used to. The specific texture of someone actually listening for the answer, rather than waiting to steer the conversation back toward familiar ground. I think about that retirement party often, the specific moment of hearing my own mother describe me, in front of a room full of her colleagues, as someone who might never really amount to anything. And I think about how close that comment came to simply passing, unremarked, the way so many similar comments had passed before it. If Eleanor Vance hadn't happened to be in that room, hadn't happened to recognize my name, hadn't decided on her own initiative that the record deserved correcting. I got fortunate, in a very specific sense, that the right person happened to be present at the right moment, and I think about that luck often, about how many people never get that particular correction, whose actual work simply stays invisible to the people who matter most to them, forever, for lack of exactly that kind of accidental, well-timed intervention. What I've come to believe since that evening is something I wish I'd understood much earlier in my own life. You don't need your mother's understanding to know the actual value of your own work. You can build something significant, something that genuinely matters, entirely outside the frame of reference someone else has decided is the only legitimate one, and that work doesn't stop being real just because it goes unrecognized at the dinner table for years. Sometimes, if you're fortunate, the truth finds its own way into the room eventually, spoken by someone else entirely, at exactly the moment you'd stopped expecting it to arrive at all, and it doesn't erase the years of feeling unseen, but it does finally let the people who love you start looking a little more carefully at who you actually turned out to be.